Okay, good afternoon. I'm Kata Beilin, Faculty Director of LASIS, and I have a pleasure of welcoming everyone for today's panel of our migration webinar series, today titled Transnational Migration and Migration from Venezuela. This migration webinar series has been prepared in collaboration between Latin American, Iberian, and Caribbean Studies program from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank all the faculty and staff involved in preparation of this migration webinar series, in particular the organizing committee and our LASIS staff, as well as staff of CLACS. Always when we begin the webinar series, we talk that migration is when people are forced by different circumstances to abandon their homes and move in search of a safer place. And today we will focus on this movement in a global transnational sense, and in particular we'll focus on Venezuela, which recently has been one of those places where these circumstances forcing people outside of their home have been particularly dramatic. And today's panel has been prepared by Professor Leslie Bartlett, who is a faculty director of the Institute for Regional International Studies at UW-Madison, which is also co-sponsoring our migration webinar series. Leslie is an anthropologist and professor in educational policy studies. And she has done extensive field work in Brazil and Dominican Republic in the fields of migration, human rights, and education. So thank you so much, Leslie. Thank you, Luis and Diana, for being part of today's panel. And thanks everyone who has joined us today, even though, as Alberto says, it's such a beautiful day. And without further ado, I'll let Leslie to introduce the speakers.
Thank you so much, Kata. So as Kata said, my name is Leslie Bartlett. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today in this spectacular series that LASIS has organized. I want to briefly introduce our speakers and then save as much time as we can to hear from them. So Professor Feline Freier is an associate professor of political science at the Universidad del Pacífico in Lima, Peru, and her research focuses on migration and refugee policies and laws in Latin America, as well as on South-South migration, and particularly the Venezuelan displacement crisis. She's in great demand as a speaker about this crisis. She is incredibly informed about it, and often has been asked to speak to the BBC, El País, and other media outlets about it. She's also been a consultant with organizations such as Amnesty International, UNHCR, IOM, the World Bank, and the EU about this topic, among others. She's a migration research and publishing high-level advisor to the IOM. The title of her talk today is Understanding the Venezuelan Displacement Crisis in Times of COVID-19. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our other speaker as well to save a bit of time. Professor Diana Rodriguez Gomez is an assistant professor in the Educational Policy Studies Department at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her ethnographic work draws on the anthropology of the state, refugee studies, education in emergencies, and comparative and international education to examine the internal workings of educational systems that are related to or concerning peace-building efforts. She's completed research with Colombian refugees in Ecuador, with internally displaced people in Colombia, and at the Colombian-Venezuelan border as well. Recently, she and her colleagues have just launched a special issue of the Journal of Education and Emergencies focused on the educational nexus of the war on drugs. So welcome to you both. We're delighted that you're here. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for this kind introduction. I will now share my screen. Can you see it already? So let me just, okay, perfect. So thank you once again for this kind introduction and for the invitation to speak to you today. I got my master's degree at LASIS in 2008, so it really feels like a bit of homecoming. And although I'm not physically in Madison, we're all separated due to this pandemic, but I know Madison. I have very fond memories. So thank you so much for the invitation. When we were chatting a little earlier with Diana, I confessed that what I'm going to do today is something that as professors, we always tell our students not to do. And that is packing too many different arguments and too many different aspects into one paper or into one presentation. However, I've got a justification, excuse or justification, and that is that I feel whenever I speak about the Venezuelan displacement crisis in the United States or in Europe, there seems to be very little consciousness that this really is the second biggest displacement crisis in the world right now, and that we should be studying it from many different aspects. Also in academic circles or speaking to an academic audience, so it's both, no? It's the need to understand the phenomena better, but it's also this opportunity for scholars and for research students, graduate students, to study a phenomenon that is only evolving, right? So that said, I think it's an opportunity to kind of give you an overview of this phenomena, and in between highlight areas where we have been doing some research from the Universidad del Pacífico, but also where maybe some of you, if you're still looking for research topics for master's thesis or potential PhD thesis, hopefully might find that there is interesting room for further exploration. I would also like to highlight that some of these research areas I will highlight, and some of the papers I mentioned were done with different colleagues, were written with different colleagues. So this is not about self-promoting my work, but I've been very fortunate in that I've been able to coordinate two and a half research projects over the last 2 years. So I've been working with various great colleagues in different disciplines. And that is the last thing I will say before I actually start with the presentation. So migration is a transversal phenomena, right? And although I'm a political scientist through my PhD, as many of you, I studied LASIS as an interdisciplinary program, you know? And I think that is a good thing. As junior academics, I think some of us have felt like a little bit lost of what we're going to do or where we're going to go with an interdisciplinary degree. And I think another motivation for me to give this broad overview of the issue is to show you how important interdisciplinary approaches are. So without further ado, I'll be speaking about the Venezuelan displacement crisis and about how to understand both the displacement and policy reactions. I took out the COVID-19 for now because as I was preparing today, I realized that would just probably get too long. If there is time, I'm very happy to speak about that because our research has been ongoing in the last 7 months of COVID. But maybe we can also leave that for the Q&A, and I'd be very happy to answer questions as to how things have further evolved or changed during the pandemic. So I will be talking about the Venezuelan displacement crisis and how that is a test for policy liberalization in the areas of immigration and refugee policies in Latin America. I will speak specifically about the policy reactions to the Venezuelan displacement crisis, and then come to a more theoretical approach of understanding migration policy making in the region. So what is this phenomena of Venezuelan displacement? These are some pictures. They were taken pre-COVID. The one on the bottom right is actually a picture I took myself in Cucuta in 2019. The picture on the top was taken from the internet and also shows the border crossing between Venezuela and Colombia in Cucuta. So this is the famous Simón Bolívar Bridge. And what we see on top is the formal border crossing, and on the bottom we see the informal trochas, where people are or have been, and as far as I'm informed, are still, even in times of COVID and in times of lockdown, crossing informally between Venezuela and Colombia. This area is under control of armed forces, informal armed forces, especially on the Venezuelan side of the border. How many people have left, and when did this Venezuelan displacement crisis start? Usually when we talk about this, both in academic and policy circles, we will mostly have in mind the most recent mass displacement, which started around 2014 or 15. But I think it's really important to give a little bit of context. So Venezuelan immigration actually already started at the end of the 1990s, but has evolved in its form and regarding its characteristics. So in the first phase of Venezuelan immigration, which started with the failed coup against Hugo Chavez in 2002, elites, so it was really the elite or the upper middle class who decided that they would leave Venezuela because their political convictions and or economic interests did not align with Chavez regime. There was a second phase, which started with the expropriation and the nationalization of various industries in 2006, but it was still pretty similar. Elite and middle-class migrants, many of them trying or getting student visas actually abroad and then not returning. So this is something that we saw from the in the first half of the 2000s, basically. And I think it's important to point this out. So according to a study from the Central University of Venezuela, between 1999 and 2014, already 1.5 million Venezuelans had left and not returned to their home countries. And as I said, usually when we talk about the Venezuelan displacement crisis, we're usually referring to this third phase, which started with the humanitarian crisis, so the social, economic, and political crisis that really spiraled out of control in Venezuela, more or less since 2014. But the steep increase in immigration flows really took place in 2017, since 2017. Another interesting, it almost seems historical, though it's only a few years old, data comes from the surveying company Consultores 21, and they found in late 2017 already that over 4 million Venezuelans had left. And very importantly, if you see this number, that 51%, so half of all young adults, said they wanted to migrate if they could. I'll come to the recent numbers in a second, but right now there was an update, and I'll show it to you in a couple of slides. So right now the last numbers from UNHCR and IOM were 5.5 million Venezuelans outside of Venezuela as of October 2020. We have to take all these numbers with a grain of salt, because obviously they depend, in the case of United Nations, on the official data that states hand into these organizations, and all over the world, but especially in Latin America, those numbers are not always accurate. So it's always a good idea to kind of juxtapose the official numbers with these kind of survey estimates to maybe get at more accurate estimates. And usually the surveys will estimate the numbers higher than official numbers. Why do people leave? When I teach or talk about Venezuelan immigration, and in our case immigration in Peru, I always ask my students to estimate the inflation rate of Venezuela, and I do that by first asking them when they remember, when their parents and grandparents remember the worst economic crisis Peru ever saw, which was bad in the 1980s, it was very bad. And this is very much ingrained here in Peruvian memory. And I asked them whether they know what the inflation rate was, when really basically there was nothing to buy, money was worth nothing in Peru, people left, people emigrated. And as our university that focuses strongly on economics, many of my students know, and they tell me the number, which is 7,000%, which is already a crazy number if we think about inflation. In Venezuela in 2018, the inflation was 1 million%. I'm not an economist, but I think whenever I spoke to economists about this, it's just a number beyond comprehension or beyond imagination. So basically, your money in Venezuela has been and is worth nothing. Also, according to Caritas, already at the end of 2017, 87% of the population was living in poverty. And food insecurity affected 80%. These numbers, you might ask, why did I not update them? The problem is that right now, and increasingly in the last 2-3 years, it is very hard to come by reliable data, official data from Venezuela. So I prefer to stick to these numbers that I feel comfortable presenting. We know that things have not gotten better. We know that things have gotten worse. One number that always strikes me as a mother of 3 young children is that already, according to Caritas, end of 2017, 33% of children showed irreversible mental and physical development delays due to malnutrition. And that only 3% of households ate 3 times a day. These are, and again, since then, things have gotten worse and worse and worse. On the political level, also 2018, there were close to 10,000 protests, deaths, casualties, arrests, and reports of torture by international organizations. So it's really a multi-dimensional crisis, humanitarian, political, and economic, that has led to this forced displacement of Venezuelan citizens. I also always like to give, to put faces to our research, and with the permission of these 2 young men, I'd like to briefly introduce 2 of these migrants, 2 of the people who have left and whom I've met during the course of my research. This is Albert. He's 25. He was an IT student in Caracas, and I interviewed him in the border between Ecuador and Peru in May 2018. Albert was very lucky because he got some money from his aunt to buy his bus ticket, which back then cost $130 to reach Peru, because his aunt wanted him to accompany his cousin. However, he was unlucky because while crossing through Ecuador, he had all his belongings stolen. He had his passport, his ID stolen, and he was, when I interviewed him, waiting at the Ecuador-Peru border. He had been waiting for 3 days without any money for food, asking the Peruvian authorities to let him into the country. Albert's case is also interesting because he had a severe conflict with his father before leaving, because his father is a supporter of, was a supporter of Chavez, is a supporter of the Maduro regime, and Albert does not agree with his father's political views. When Albert told his dad that he would migrate to Peru, his dad hit him and called him a traitor to the patria. This is Benjamin. He's 23, or was 23 in 2018. He's 25 now. We're still in touch over Facebook. He's an artist and an entrepreneur, fashion designer. And I met him in Mexico City in 2018. His story is interesting. And again, there's so many things here to research. So I cannot stress this enough. So many important issues. Why do I share? Why did I pick Benjamin? Benjamin used Grindr to get out of Venezuela. Those were his words. He met someone, like he met his former boyfriend, but he said he was never really in love with his ex-boyfriend, who was American, actually US American, but that through that encounter on Grindr, they struck an agreement and met in Mexico, in Cancun. And his ex-boyfriend or ex-partner or ex-acquaintance helped him to get a plane ticket and the confirmation of the hotel which he needed to be able to enter Mexico. Benjamin's story really struck me because when we spoke, he told me that half of his friends, according to Benjamin, had chosen or had been forced to choose prostitution in order to get out of Venezuela. He spoke about his sister who was working as a prostitute in Colombia. He told me that his mother supported her choice just so that she could send home some money and feed his mother's grandchildren, so her own children. And he told me about stories of friends, young women, young men who went into prostitution across South America and even in countries as far as Dubai or the United Emirates States to get out of Venezuela, just to get out. And that really struck me because we had actually various very long interviews, and Benjamin told me about his childhood, very normal middle-class family, and this forced exit option of prostitution is something that I haven't further explored, but it's one of the many issues that really are there for further exploration. So what are Venezuelans? Are they migrants or are they refugees? And Kata, when you introduced today's session, you very much implied this need to move very often. No? But what we still have both in sorry, I will put away the phone. I'm trying to check the time and Siri. I don't know, my children had the phone. Okay, I'll just leave it. I just don't have another. So maybe if someone could let me know, wait, where are we now? When I have 10 minutes left, that would be wonderful. So I don't keep activating Siri. I'm so sorry. Let me get back to the slideshow. So Kata, you were very much implying this need to leave very often. No? And what we still have both in policy debates and also in academic debates is this strict separation between voluntary economic migrants and forced migrants or refugees. Yeah? And I think this question is extremely relevant in the case of Venezuela, but the answer really is it's not that easy. Yeah. So here we have the up-to-date numbers. I just took these screenshots today. Probably underestimated. The real numbers are larger because this does not necessarily, in some cases, states try to include irregular flows, but as we all know, these are extremely hard to measure. So I would judge these still as rather conservative estimates. And here we are in Peru with over 1 million Venezuelan citizens. These are the numbers of asylum applications, and if we think about it, now it's kind of striking because I said it's more than 5.5 million Venezuelans outside of Venezuela altogether. I gave you the context of this dramatic forced displacement, and yet we only have 800,000 asylum seekers worldwide. What is more, we have almost 500,000, so more than 60% of these are in Peru. Now, there are some explanations to why that is, but again, as a potential research topic, there's a lot to investigate and a lot to ask here. Maybe we can come to it in the Q&A. I will continue a little bit with my narrative, but if someone is interested in this, there are some explanations, but these explanations have not really been proven or shown. So another potential area of research. In order to answer these questions, and again, here what I'm saying is it's really interesting to ask why have so few people claimed asylum or filed asylum claims, and why so many in Peru. But the broader question is, what are they? Are they migrants? Are they refugees? And what we need to understand to answer that question is that in Latin America, we are in a very special position. And I'll come to it in a few minutes more broadly, but with a view to this question, 16 countries in the region have not only incorporated the definition of the United Nations of 51, the definition of refugee you're probably all familiar with, which defines a refugee as a person who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality, or is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. So it's very important to understand that the conventional definition of refugee is based on personal persecution for any of these reasons. Now, in Latin America, and here in this map, which was taken from Wikipedia, I must admit, you see the parties to both the convention and its protocol, right? Which, with the exception of Venezuela, interestingly, is the case of almost all countries in the region. But almost all countries in the region have also included, and very importantly, have included into their domestic refugee laws a broader definition. And this is the definition of Cartagena. And Cartagena also includes as refugees those who flee because their lives, safety, or freedom have been threatened by generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflicts, massive violation of human rights, or other circumstances which have seriously disturbed public order. Now, this is something, we started to saying and in Latin America, we have the advantage of not only being academics, many of us are also activists, maybe a little bit more so than in the global South. And this has been something we've been saying since the beginning. Cartagena applies. If we look at this, very clearly, there are economic issues. If you think of inflation rate of 1,000,000%, you can work as much as you want, your money is worth nothing. If you don't have dollars, if you don't have remittances, you can work, but you might as well not work because your salary is worth nothing in order to buy basic products, food, whatever you need. This is, and it only goes up to 2016 when the emigration really took off. But it shows the clear correlation between asylum seekers as a proxy for flows and the economic collapse of Venezuela. However, we also see this correlation with homicide, murder rates. And there are so many stories. I think overall, in the different projects, we have spoken to close to 2,000 Venezuelan migrants and asylum seekers. And I very clearly remember one interview of a young woman, mother of 3 children, who told us, the father of my first son was murdered in Venezuela due to generalized violence. The father of my second son was murdered due to generalized violence. My eldest son was murdered in the street. They're not gonna murder this one. And that's what she said while she had her little baby with her in the interview. So although we don't have many situations, there of course also exists political persecution of opposition members, but there is really this flight from generalized violence in Venezuela. I have here one quote, which was a testimony in front of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. I'll read it in Spanish. Pensar diferente en Venezuela es un pecado y lo pagas con cárcel, con represión y con ser violentado tus derechos como persona. Hoy en día en Venezuela no se respetan los derechos humanos, no los tenemos. No nos respeta ni siquiera el derecho a satisfacer nuestras necesidades básicas, como es la comida, como es la salud y como es el derecho a pensar diferente. So if you're interested in this issue, the application of Cartagena and the question whether Venezuelans are migrants or refugees, we have worked on this with 2 great colleagues, legal scholars here in Peru, and we have an article out in the Revista Chilena de Derecho, where we really focus on a legal analysis of the applicability. Now I speak Spanish because that paper is in Spanish, especially on the element of massive violations of human rights in Venezuela and how the states themselves, so the Organization of American States, but also the Lima Group, I'll talk about that in a second. So the states in the region, in their formal declarations, they talk about massive violations of human rights. They talk about the breakdown of public order, but and this is the next point, they have not applied Cartagena in a significant level across the region. Let me just check the time. Okay. So what have been the policy reactions? What we need to understand, and I already mentioned this, maybe I'll show you this first. What we need to understand is this really special position of Latin America when it comes to both immigration and refugee laws. I'm starting here with the refugee laws, and this is a paper out with Jean-Pierre Gauci. So if you're interested in this, you could find it, Freier and Gauci, which just came out like last week in Refugee Survey Quarterly, where we compared the legislative good practices, so the laws between European Union and America, Latin America. And we did that because the UNHCR for a very long time hailed Latin America as the new avant-garde of refugee protection. And what you see in the chart bar is the European protection standards at 0, and then all the countries to the right are basically more progressive, are more generous when it comes to refugee protection than the European Union. And why the European Union? Because so far European Union protection standards, though not always applied in practice, have been not considered as leaders in the world. And then all the other countries on the left of 0 have lower protection standards. So what we see here is that in refugee protection, it's not the entire region, but there are some countries in the region that really have the most progressive laws in the world. And now I'll go back. And this applies to a certain degree to refugee laws, right? And I will not go into detail. The only thing I want you to take away here is that on the one hand side, almost all countries in the region have reformed their immigration and their refugee law rather recently. And there are a couple of elements that are really exceptional in these laws. So one of the things is the right to migrate. It's not quite clear what that actually means, but a couple of laws, and even, Diana, you know more about that, but the Ecuadorian constitution speaks of the right to migrate. These laws also speak about the non-criminalization of migrants, the regularization of irregular migrants, and the ideal of regional citizenship. In the area of asylum or refugee protection, we have the Cartagena definition, which I just explained to you, and also complementary pathways to protection and specification of grounds for protection, for example, in the area of gender or sexual orientation. So why is this important? It's important because it gives us the background, right? So Venezuelan displacement did not happen in a vacuum, not in a social, economic, and not in a political vacuum. And the political or legal context really was this exceptional legislative liberalization across the region. But Venezuelan displacement really is the first test for these new laws. So again, it's really fascinating, and there is so much here to research because we have like this very progressive legal landscape, and right now with Venezuelan displacement, we have a real test for policy implementation across the region. This I already mentioned. So basically here it was just a quote, just you know, but I will not read it out, of the ministers of the Lima group. The Lima group was one of the regional groups that came together to find a solution to the Venezuelan crisis. And basically these quotes just show how in their declaration, they really nominate and put names to exactly the different elements of the Cartagena refugee definition. So if we believe in the Estado de Derecho, if we believe in the rule of law, Venezuelans should be considered refugees across the region, and they actually should be recognized prima facie, which means recognized as groups. So it's in the spirit of Cartagena to not look at every case individually, but to say that if these are the circumstances that make people flee, they apply to groups of people fleeing from the same country or region. But what we see in practice were alternative pathways to legal status. And here again, so much has happened in these last 2 or 3 years that it seems like a decade or two. We saw initially a very progressive, a very open and welcoming stance. And I think it's important to stress that, although I'll get more critical in the minutes I have left of my presentation. But in the beginning, I mean, we were talking about tens of thousands of migrants and asylum seekers that already had entered neighboring countries, and approaches remained open. As academics and civil society, we're always critical, because what happened? Very often these progressive laws were not applied. So Cartagena was not applied, or like in other instances, alternative and more sustainable regularization mechanisms that were already enshrined in the laws were not applied, but what we saw were more ad hoc reactions. So just to give you like an idea of numbers here, in total, 2.4 million Venezuelans have some kind of legal status in the region. That's not bad, but if we compare it to the number of recognized refugees, in Peru, for example, it's only 1,200 recognized refugees. And even though, you know, almost 500,000 Venezuelans have legal status, it means that there is at least another 500,000 that does not have legal status. And it means that we have this policy gap between what the law promises and what has been done in practice. So reactions differed. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but basically some countries, Mexico and Brazil, have applied Cartagena, but not to all Venezuelans, to groups. Other countries such as Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay perhaps implemented the most sustainable reaction. What they did is they simply applied the Mercosur residency agreement, which has been enforced since 2009, unilaterally to Venezuelan citizens. And why do I say unilaterally? Because Venezuela has been suspended from Mercosur, if I'm not mistaken, since 2017. And these states nevertheless said that the what do you call it? Not the expulsion, the temporary, ¿cuál es la palabra? Exclusion of Venezuela from Mercosur was a measure against the government and not against its people, and that they would still give legal residence to Venezuelan citizens, which was basically the easiest thing to do, and which was an option, a legal option open to almost all the countries in the region who are either member or affiliate states of Mercosur. Ecuador was a little bit of a separate case. They, in the beginning, applied the UNASUR visa, which was very expensive though. Yeah, it had an application cost of $50, and the visa itself was $500. So if we think about the fact that basically Venezuelans could not save any money, that basically many of them lost all their savings, that for many paying the $130 for a bus ticket has increasingly become impossible, and people are now walking across the region because they cannot save. Even if they sell their houses, they sell their cars, they sell everything they have, they do not have enough money. And that's why we see now tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans that have walked across the region, mostly towards the country of destination, now with COVID, in some cases back to Venezuela. These costs are prohibitive. In Peru and Colombia, we had special permits or visas, and Chile already in 2018 implemented a so-called visa of democratic responsibility. And here, Chile was really the not so progressive avant-garde, because this is something we have now seen in other countries, such as Peru and Ecuador, the introduction of more and more requirements. And I did not list them all in order to not to confuse you more, because it is quite confusing. But basically, these initial ad hoc, so again, there already was an implementation gap. Countries did not do what the book said, what the laws said, but they tried to find rather creative alternative forms of handing out visas and residency permits. What we've seen in the last 2 years really was a restrictive shift, especially in Ecuador and Peru, with the introduction of increasing requirements, in the first case, a passport, and then other so-called humanitarian visas, that in practice, they're really euphemisms, because in Venezuela, given the situation, it is impossible for most people to pay the corrupt fees necessary to receive a passport. So the passport is prohibitive. The timeline for appointments in the consulates are prohibitive, because they cannot, before COVID, they were giving citas, they were giving appointments for the humanitarian visas, or in the case of Chile, visa of democratic responsibility, for 2022. And lastly, most of these visas require a clean criminal record, that in Venezuela you also only get if you pay, basically if you're corrupt and if you pay extra fees underneath the table. So how can we understand these migration policies? And maybe Leslie, now, can you just give me an indication of how many minutes I have left, maybe in the chat, so that I know how fast I go, and I'll quickly expel my children from the room. Sorry. So I don't know, I can't, so I'll continue.
About 5 minutes. Yes,
5 minutes?
Thank you.
Okay, so I will focus on this image. So in order to understand these different reactions, we have to understand the shift in the type of governments that are ruling in Latin America between this era of legal liberalization and the era of the first, and you're talking about the first initial phase of these surprisingly liberal and welcoming approaches towards Venezuelan immigration. So 2008 was the height of the pink tide, sorry, not the liberal tide, the pink tide or the red tide in Latin America. So the majority of countries were governed by left of center or even populist leftist governments. 2018, we actually have a majority of conservative or right of center governments governing in the region. And this is a research puzzle, right? Because at least the mainstream political science immigration literature would say that center-right governments are less likely to receive or to be welcoming towards immigrants and asylum seekers. So how can we explain this? Basically, what we saw at the height of the liberal tide were these populist, rebellious migration and asylum discourses. And I cannot read them all out. I'm very happy to share the presentation afterwards. But it was this discourse, if you see here, Correa 2008, that there are no illegal citizens, only practices that violate the right of persons. Or in the area of refugee protection, Kirchner was really criticizing northern countries who are no examples. I don't want to resemble countries that deport migrants and let little boys die at their beaches, referring to this image we've probably all seen of Alan Kurdi, who died at the height of the Syrian refugee crisis. So I'll skip some of the slides. What happened? In this first moment of legislative liberalization, we were in a moment of democratization and at the same time of mass emigration. So many countries in the region had gone through economic crisis and were now more concerned with diaspora policies, and they were concerned with the populist rejection of the West by left of center governments. And that included the rejection of Western or Northern, however I want to term it, immigration policies. So this led to these populist liberal discourses, which then in combination with low numbers of migrants and low costs, so there wasn't really a cost to extending rights to migrants and refugees because there were very few, right? And it was really civil society who helped then pressure governments to stand up or live up to their discourses and transfer them into liberalization of laws. The same thing in asylum, refugee laws, very similar. I'll skip this. And in 2018, what we saw was really the preoccupation with the Venezuelan crisis from a foreign policy perspective as well, but it was the rejection of the Maduro regime by center-right governments who accepted Venezuelan migrants and asylum seekers as a strong symbol, if you want, of international rejection of Maduro. So basically, there's a whole literature on this in political science that as a country, if you receive and protect citizens of another state, you really condemn that government and shame that government internationally. And that is, I'll also skip this. Here you just see how, how many of Latin American countries supported Guaido, so we opposed Maduro, the vast majority. So this is what happened until the numbers really reached a point where there was a shift from foreign to domestic policy concerns. So once the numbers exceeded, and imagine Peru is a population of 30 million people, and we have 1 million Venezuelans who basically came in 3 years. So this is a tremendous challenge, and unfortunately, public opinion has shifted in the last 1.5 years. We see now the same things we see in the United States and Europe. We see the criminalization of migrants, we see the securitization of migration policy, and we see how states are becoming more restrictive or governments are becoming more restrictive because they now see migration as a domestic policy issue. So to wrap up, we have to understand migration policy making due to economic constraints, this tension between foreign and domestic policy concerns, this tension also in the region. On the one hand side, we have this new paradigm of human rights, the right to migrate enshrined in laws, but we also have the securitization paradigm, which never really went away. Public opinion, I already mentioned. So there's this great paper by Mr. Galen Maldonado who say Latin Americans are kind to immigrants, yet reluctant to immigration. And I'm mentioning all these things because there is so much room for research here. We have a few studies, like really good public opinion studies on migration in Latin America. We're working on it, but it's just a big invitation if you're interested in any of these issues to consider the Venezuelan case as a really rich and interesting case study. Lastly, we also have to understand these policy reactions, both the liberalization of laws and now these ad hoc reactions and changing reactions to Venezuelans in the context of hyper-presidentialism. So most of these policy reactions were based on presidential decrees. They were precisely not based on the application of the law. So weak institutions, those of you who are interested in political science, you've heard this, weak institutions and very strong presidents who can basically do what they see fit, depending on whether they see the protection of migrants and refugees as a foreign or as a domestic policy concern. And this is my last slide. I think there's nothing that new really. So I think with this, I can stop. I know I said too much, but I do hope that I maybe informed you about the situation. And I also hope that I maybe instilled in you the interest to follow up. And you can always email me. I'm very happy to share the papers we've already produced or to guide you or answer any questions in case you would be interested in conducting research of any of these issues yourself. So thank you so much. And I really look forward to your talk, Diana.
Thank you so much, Professor Freier. That was fantastic. So Deanna, we're looking forward to hearing you. The title of Dean's talk is Universal Citizenship and the Quest for Educational Access Among Colombian Refugees in Ecuador.
Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen. I cleaned my desktop, so it should look nice and neat now. Let me click here. Okay, first of all, I wanna thank the Migration webinar series organizers for setting this much needed conversation on migration. And I wanna thank Feline because I think that overview is gonna help us a lot understand the specific case of Ecuador. And even though I won't be talking specifically about Venezuelans, I think that the case of Colombian refugees coming into Ecuador will help us make sense of what what's happening with Venezuelans and some of the challenges they're facing. So today I'm going to talk about a piece of my ethnographic work in Ecuador. I'm going to focus on Ecuador, on Quito, I'm sorry, and I titled today's presentation, Universal Citizenship and the Quest for Educational Access Among Colombian Refugees in Ecuador, to highlight the tension between the promises of this citizenship without boundaries that Feline mentioned and the lived experiences of forced migrants, particularly refugees. Some of you might be wondering, why do we need to talk about access to school when we're witnessing so much chaos around the world? And right now in the US, we're dealing with elections, fires, hurricanes, and unfortunately, COVID-19 has created what the UN has called the greatest disruption in education, pushing 1.6 billion children out of the school. That makes the conversation about access to a school urgent, to say the least. Also, I think that we need to check out some of the numbers that the UNHCR offer us. We know these are not perfect numbers, and now I'm curious to compare my numbers with Feline's numbers to see if they match, but at least they give us a sense of what's going on. So we know that refugee children are twice as likely to be out of a school as a non-refugee child. 48% of all refugee children of a school age are out of a school right now. According to the Malala Fund, half of refugee girls wouldn't come back to school when classes reopened. And we know that refugee status also implies some extra layers of vulnerability that when it comes to education are very visible in the poor capacity to cover education fees and precarious access to internet, TV and phone data plans. So barriers to access education have been have been a long-standing challenge. And what I tried to do here was to share with you some of the solutions that scholars and practitioners have been designing to guarantee that more refugees have access to a school. So we know that these solutions go from apps that host high quality learning materials to mobile mentoring for teachers via WhatsApp and public schools with double shifts. However, and this is where I think there's a link between, or an important link between what Feline was talking about and my presentation. When we talk about the state, I think that the solutions that we're offering seem very poor. It seems like we need to bring the private sector in order to improve the state. And then when we go to reports that talk about refugee education, we notice that the role that the state and the bureaucracy play is rarely discussed. And if somebody talks about it, we're gonna find sentences such as registration in the national education system as a problem, ID documents and certificates detailing previous education, lack of documents, but there's no analysis, careful analysis of bureaucracy. And what really worries me about finding these sentences, these phrases populating UNHCR reports is that it seems that we are blaming refugees for not having the documents that they should have. It seems that we're assuming that bureaucracy is the natural order of things, when at the end, we know that bureaucracy is nothing else than a construction. So with that in mind, I went to Ecuador back in the period between 2013, 2014, during Rafael Correa Delgado government. And as a part of a larger ethnographic study of Colombian refugee youth living in Ecuador, I wanted to understand the processes of policy appropriation. I mean, Ecuador had this generous and, as Feline described, very open migration framework. So I wanted to understand how that framework was impacting youth's everyday experiences. So I posed 2 questions. The first one, how do state agents and people with refugee status participate in and interact with the provision of access to school in Quito? And the second one, what resources do refugees use to guarantee educational access? Also, because I was intrigued by the agency that all these individuals that we try just to limit with the category refugee were displaying in negotiating their encounters with a new and unknown state. So to answer these questions, I approach bureaucracies as terrains of lived experience. And in contrast to those who approach policies only as documents, I approach policy as a social practice, as a place where actors with different levels of agency and power negotiate to define the terms in which social problems are defined and how behaviors and resources are going to be organized and allocated. From this perspective, as I already mentioned, I see refugees as street-level bureaucrats and policymakers as creative agents with different levels of knowledge and experience who use policy as vehicles to secure their own goals. This means that in contrast to the Bavarian notion of a rational, organized, perfectly structured and layered bureaucracy, I wanted to focus more on its unpredictability, how indeterminate, and how even irrational it can be. So with this lens, I enter my field site, and well, I think that Feline made it much easier for me at this point to justify why talking about Ecuador is important. But when we go to literature on refugee education, there's a tendency to neglect Ecuador. You can see here in this screenshot that I took yesterday, Ecuador is not even highlighted in the map. And besides that, I can't point here, but Ecuador hosts populations from refugee populations from Haiti, from Venezuela, from Colombia, but also from Afghanistan and Pakistan. So it has a very diverse refugee population. Besides that, Ecuador is the country of Latin America hosting the largest number of people in need of international protection. There's approximately 70 million refugees, 97% of them are still Colombian. And according to new data, there are almost around 25,000 asylum seekers, 74% of them Venezuelans. Between 2007 and 2017, Rafael Correa just undertook a major state reform, and that included a complete reorganization of the educational system. So it was a great place to understand how the promises of educational policy would impact the opportunities to enter a school, for refugee populations to enter a school. So here's, I'm sorry, I forgot I had this slide here, but Feline already mentioned it, right? I mean, in the Ecuador's constitution, we had this notion of universal citizenship, which grants immigrants the same political rights as nationals, including, of course, education. That means that in paper, migratory status doesn't create differential opportunities to enter a school. And what I want to highlight here too is that it wasn't only the constitution, but you could find a specific decrees and then content about access to school for refugees in the educational policy. So you could see how the message translated into all levels of policy implementation. To enter a school in Ecuador, everything a kid needs, it's 2 documents. The first one, an identification card, and a proof of her residential address. It can be a utility bill that has the address included. The schools are expected to grant temporary enrollment to students who cannot provide these 2 documents, and that gives them time to collect them. So as you can see, it's very different from other countries where there's a long list of requirements. So the key message that I want to share with you through this presentation is that even though the Ecuadorian legal framework aims to universalize and standardize the procedures for school access for children between 5 and 18 years old, the street-level bureaucrats, or what we commonly called public officials, interpret policies in ways that create partial and individualized opportunities for the most marginalized children. I'm going to show you how that happens. And what really concerns me here is that we can see how the social inequality that refugees already face can be produced and expanded by a state that is full of good intentions. So I think that this, the data that I'm going to show you, really pushes to think about how can we work with the state to do a better job. I mean, it's not enough to bring the private sector into the table. We need to look at the state more carefully and to see how at all levels of its administrative apparatus, policy is being designed and enacted. So I think that many of you can relate to an organizational chart as the one that I'm showing you now. This one was from 2013, after the major educational reform that Ecuador went through. And I remember I asked a high-ranking official at the Ministry of Education to describe his responsibilities. And he said, well, my responsibility was to execute the decisions that were made at the national policy level and to roll them out on the ground. I was, how would you say, the bridge between the policymakers and the rest of the system. I was connected with those on top and with the rest of the system, that is, to the schools, colleges, and other educational institutions. This vertical representation that Elias had of his mind, of the work that he was doing, and his position within the ministry, show us this assumption of a high-level group that does the thinking, a middle-level group that creates the programs, and then the street-level bureaucrats who are responsible for implementing the programs. And of course, this created distance across all those different levels that I show you. That distance was manifested in this common belief among high-ranking public officials that the existence of explicit rules, training workshops will shape civil employees' interpretations of policy. They assume that neoliberal managerial guidelines, which included flow charts, standards, and indicators, could map and homogenize bureaucratic practices. Yet the street-level bureaucrats that I interviewed told me that they didn't know of the 796-page manual that they were supposed to use in making decisions. Furthermore, when I analyzed the manual, I realized that it didn't include a section on forced migrants. When I asked Camilo, public official of the school district, about access for school access for refugees, he said, well, to be honest with you, I don't know how the situation is under the new procedures. It is a delicate procedure given the lack of official documentation. We try to allocate the schools the best we can. We try to guide them. We try to help people, but the lack of documents is an inconvenience. For example, the old procedures accepted passports, but many migrants came without a passport. They only brought the refugee identification card. With the refugee identification card, you cannot confirm the person's information and enroll him. This testimony evidences a tension between Camilo's willingness and personal commitment to facilitate access to school for all, and how he interacted with individuals with refugee status. Even though he acknowledged his limited understanding of educational policy, he couldn't foresee that he could be the one who prevented a potential student from entering the education system. So the second finding, and I won't read this because everything that relates to bureaucracy is way too convoluted, but this is the case of a woman that goes to many offices with her 2 children, 13 documents under her arm. She makes a line, and when she finally meets a civil employee, he tells her, hey, I cannot give you access because you're a refugee. And at that point, Carla, she was unemployed, and she decided that the only resource that she had in hand was time. So she went out of the office and went in line again, crossing fingers she would meet a different civil employee. This time, the new civil employee welcomed her to Ecuador, accepted the 13 documents, even though he only needed 2, and guaranteed her that her kids will have a school. Yet, at the point where he had to decide which grade each of them will go, he decided not to trust the academic reports that they brought from Colombia, but he decided that according to how tall the oldest daughter was, he will assign her to a different level. So here you can see how the same public official is making different interpretations of the same policy. Also, I think that this Carla's story tells us about how unpredictable interactions with civil employees can be, and all the different emotions that they go through, right? I mean, she experienced indifference, negligence, solidarity, camaraderie, and distrust at the end. Also, you can see the very vertical power that street level bureaucrats had over refugees in their quest for access. Another example that shows us how street level bureaucrats interpret educational policy in very fragmented ways was given by Octavia. I'm going to read this one. It's very Kafkaesque, but I think it gives us a great sense of how difficult it was to navigate bureaucracy, even though we need to remember these are populations that speak the same language and have very similar cultural background. It was very hard, Octavia said. I was like a puppet. First, I went to the school, but they couldn't give me a place because first I had to be registered. They said that was something new. So I told them to give me the document to present, and the answer was that they couldn't do that. From the school, I was sent to the district offices located in La Carolina to register. From the district office, they sent me to Pomaski, but from Pomaski, they sent me to the Ministry of Education because I was Colombian. And from the ministry, I was sent back once again to Pomaski. I spent about 13 days on that. When at Pomaski, they finally realized that they had to register me. They told me that I had to present the citizen's ID card of an Ecuadorian person to register because I was Colombian. But how was I to provide an Ecuadorian citizen's ID card if I am my daughter's representative? I have a refugee's ID card that I always use here. But the answer was no, the system doesn't accept it. So I went to an NGO, and Lucero lent me her citizen's ID card, and the issue was settled. So according to written policy, neither nationality nor migratory status should limit school access, but in practice, they do. There was a mismatch between the number of digits on the refugee identification card and the Ministry of Education's online enrollment platform, making it difficult for refugee ID card holders to access a school. Some Ecuadorian citizens lent their ID numbers to individuals with refugee status so they could register their children. Octavia was a very special character. She had strong, warm relationships with many of the NGO employees that I interviewed during my fieldwork, and that contrasted drastically with the story of Carolina. Yeah, here it is. So of the 8 parents I interviewed who had refugee status, 6 of them managed to guarantee access to school for all of their children, but Carolina couldn't. She was a mother of 2. She was able to find a place for her younger boy, but she couldn't find a place for Juan. So desperate, because she didn't have the money and she didn't have the resources to pay for transportation and food and run all these crazy errands. She decided that her best choice was to call her mother in Cali, to pay her to come to Quito by bus, pick up Juan, and put Juan into school back in Colombia. The fact that she didn't have the financial resources and she had a very weak support network make her believe, or push her, and honestly not make her believe, but push her to separate from her own son. Then we have Milena, and this case shows us how migratory status overlaps with race and gender. Milena, she was the mother of 16-year-old Wilson and 4 other children, and she was able to find school for 3 of the youngest, but the 2 older sons, Wilson and Cristiano, couldn't find a place after 9 months of being in Ecuador. When I asked Milena, why do you think you haven't been able to do so? She said that the fact that they were Afro-Colombians and that they were teenagers were creating barriers that their younger children didn't face. So to wrap up, I want to highlight 4 things. The first one is that education policy doesn't take shape in a social vacuum. This study shows us how the intersection of a massive education reform, migratory frameworks and regulations overlap with institutional arrangements, official documents, and the interests of those that participate in this ensemble. Then we see how there are tensions in the ways in which high-ranking officials envision what the state is and does, and how the state is experienced on the ground. I also don't want to lose the opportunity to highlight how forced migrants, particularly in this case refugees, are subjects of distrust, and distrusts from many different fronts, including the state that is expected to provide services for them. As I mentioned with the case of Carolina and Milena, we can see how migratory status is just one layer that creates barriers to access. It overlaps with socioeconomic status, age, gender, and race. And finally, I think that by analyzing the different facets of a state bureaucracy, we're able to illustrate how educational policies that promise free access to school are not enough, even when that state is full of good intentions. Before I wrap up, I thought that you will have questions about what's going on, because I know that I collected data back in 2013, 2014. So I just brought this slide summarizing some, more recent research. I was supposed to go to Ecuador this May, but of course I couldn't. So we know that for youth between 15 and 19 years old, they are more likely than others to attend a school. Until December 2018, 30,824 children and adolescents of Venezuelan nationality were registered in the Ecuadorian public educational system, and that only represents less than 1%. So we need to know more about what's going on with that population. And according to some news that I found in 2019, 54,000 students, Venezuelan students, didn't have access to school. So I'm gonna stop there, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rodriguez Gomez. I want to encourage everyone to add any questions or thoughts to the Q&A so that we can bring those into conversation. We're going to start off with a question for Professor Freier about US involvement in creating instability in the region and in Venezuela in particular. Any thoughts or comments about that?
I think I saw the first two questions on the US. I'm not that much of an expert on the situation in Venezuela in itself. I know the situation and how it affects migrants and refugees. So the only thing I can say is that Venezuela is very polemic. It's a very polemic case, and it hurts. It hurts a lot of academics, and it hurt a lot of academics when I started giving these talks already 2 years ago, because especially the left in Europe did not want to believe that this was going on, because for many scholars even, I felt for a long time, there was this hope, no, that socialism of the 21st century would work in Venezuela. So this is more of a comment, not an answer, because the US involvement, I would agree it hasn't helped, but I also understand other voices who say, how much longer are we gonna watch things without intervening? And then you can get into the whole question of, should you intervene economically or should you intervene militarily? Where I would say I follow the debate and I understand the different positions, but as a scholar, I do not feel that I'm in a position to comment on that. Unfortunately.
Here's a question for Diana. Are there possible changes now that Correa is not in power, or is education so bureaucratic that it's hard to initiate any changes?
I mean, there has been a lot of changes in Ecuador since Lenin Moreno got to power, and as Feline mentioned, there has been important changes in the way in which the country perceives migrants, Colombian and Venezuelan migrants. They created a lot of barriers to have access to refugee status. And something that I wanted to add to what Feline said is not only about the cost, but to be able to apply, to get an appointment, you need to do it internet. And I tried to do it, and it was really difficult. It was a frustrating experience. So, I mean, you're seeing like little tactics of power, right? To prevent people from coming and staying in Venezuela. In terms of the educational policy, there hasn't been any changes. And honestly, I have been paying careful attention to what the Minister of Education has been doing in terms of COVID, and their response has been, at least in paper. We will need to go there and see what they're doing. But if you check the reports from UNESCO and what they're posting on the Minister of Education website, they are keeping in mind the needs of migrants. And they don't necessarily talk about Venezuelans, but they talk about migrants in a broader sense. That's something that we need to keep in mind. I mean, right now we might be emphasizing their nationality, but when you check the database in the Ministry of Education, they don't necessarily recognize them by nationality. They just recognize them as a foreigner or a migrant.
If I may pitch in there, I don't know if that's allowed, but I was just, thank you so much, Diana, for your talk. And I just wanted to very briefly comment on the fact that we're facing the same kind of limitations. I think across the region, definitely in Peru, not only when it comes to education, when it comes to any kind of state service, but also in the private sector when it comes to opening a bank account. So in Peru, we have 5 different identity documents for Peru, for foreigners, sorry. And even for me as a high-skilled immigrant, sometimes it gets tricky because of the number of digits. So the exact same thing that you know you're describing in Ecuador. And I would say that sometimes it might be intentional and another filter, but very often it's also just lack of state capacity and lack of communication between different ministries. So everyone does their own thing, and then every change of authorities means that they want to do their own thing again, which makes things even more complicated. So yeah, and then the collapse of online systems. I had to get my international police, what do you call it, clean criminal record the other day. It was impossible for me to get, okay, now I shouldn't be saying this, especially because it's being recorded. I finally got the appointment through contacts. I did not pay, but through contacts. And when I was standing there in the police, international police, in the line with other migrants, they told me, oh no, you buy the appointment. You go like, so yeah, that is what we're facing. So thank you so much, Diana. It was fascinating and so necessary to dive deeper into those different levels of what government actually then, or governance means.
Thank you, Feline.
There's a question from Gustavo that I think both of you might speak to about whether your work challenges the distinction between voluntary migrant and involuntary refugees and whether that might be productive.
Do you want me to go first, Diana, or I have something I can say? So yes, I think so, and I think both empirically and theoretically. And one thing we did, there was so much I wanted to put in, and I couldn't. But when we did research at the border between Ecuador and Peru, and this was mixed methods research. So we conducted conjoint experiments, but also qualitative research. And what we did, we asked 1,600 migrants in 2 occasions, so 800 and 800, whether they themselves believed they were migrants or refugees. And first, when we just asked them, are you a migrant or a refugee? 40% said they were migrants. Sorry, only 40% said they were refugees. Then we asked, but was this migration voluntary or was it forced survival migration? 95% said it was forced survival migration. And when we then read the Cartagena Declaration of Refugee to them, 65% said they were refugees. So that is the empirical side of things, but that very often, we have these legal definitions that very often migrants themselves don't know, and we have these images of who's a refugee, and they themselves said no, the refugee is the Afghani refugee in the camp or the Syrian. We're not refugees. And when we then had this conversation, they realized, oh, actually we are, right? So that is the empirical side of things, and I think we have to translate that into the theoretical discussions we have about this distinction. And the distinction is fluid, right? It is, and especially when it comes to economic migration. I mean, when does voluntary economic migration stop and forced survival migration, as Alexander Bratz at Oxford would call it, start, right? So definitely, I think the Venezuelan and probably also the Colombian case, Diana, maybe you can say more about that, are cases that really question this neat categorization of who's like a voluntary economic migrant and who is someone worthy of protection as a refugee.
I think this is going to be my favorite question. I wrote my dissertation. That's what the larger study does, is it analyzes how different education stakeholders use the refugee label. And something that was very useful for me was to make a difference between the refugee label, which is institutionalized, this policy category that allocates financial resources to a particular group of people, and identity. And it worries me that we tend to conflate both things. We tend to think that because, I don't know, the news are showing us a refugee camp, all those people see themselves as refugees, but that will not be the case. We are sure that the UNHCR sees them as refugees, right? I mean, they are the ones with the policy in their minds. They are the ones who need to identify the population to be able to provide services. But migrants don't necessarily see themselves reflected on this. And I totally agree with what Feline is saying. It's so hard to make a strict difference between political reasons, economic reasons, when you're leaving. Also because armed conflict has economical implications. So yes, I'm leaving because I cannot crop what I used to crop here before. And I know that the question about the US was about Venezuela, but we know that the fact that the US sponsored Plan Colombia and the glyphosato aspersions in the coca area of Colombia pushed people out of their homes. So is that refugee or is that economic migrant? I cannot crop anymore, but at the same time, I have the paramilitary forces or the guerrilla putting more pressure on me to be able to stay here. So that said, I think that as a scholar, I'm able to understand the difference between these two terms, but then I don't want to write an article that will give arguments to those that don't believe in the refugee regime. It's not perfect. It has lots of problems, but it's the best we have to be able to guarantee these populations. So I think that we need to be strategic in how we phrase the critique and where we position it.
We're out of time, I'm afraid. I want to thank you both, Diana and Feline. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. We've learned a great deal from your presentations, and I want to thank all the participants for these wonderful questions and for your time and presence here with us today. And now I'll turn it back over to Kata.
Yes, I basically wanted to remind you to fill in the survey that is going to arrive after this Zoom is over. This helps us in planning further seminars and in our reporting, so please fill in the survey, and invite you for the next week webinar focused on crossing borders, navigating race, Blackness and migration in the Americas. Thanks very much to our panelists, Diana and Luisa. Thank you, Leslie, for moderating and preparing this wonderful panel. And that was extremely, extremely interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening. Goodbye.